Hi, my name is Anna Puchalski. I'm one of the sculptors here at Carlos Bakery. Today, I'm bored, so let's make something pretty. Today I want to do an entire cake in modeling chocolate with a little bit of a different aesthetic. So my theme today is flowers and swans. I will be making roses, water lilies, assorted greenery, and a swan. The tools that I'll be using for this project you may be familiar with if you've worked with gum paste or made flowers in another medium. We have a collection of metal cutters, some plastic leaf cutters. I'm also going to be using some standard silicone molds for detailing ball tool, which you may also be familiar with if you've made sugar flowers. And here's the one difference is we're going to be sticking everything together with water. One thing that I like to do before starting on a cake project is I like to create a sketch. This is the sketch. I may change this as I go through, but at least I know what my end product is aiming for. All right, let's jump in by making some roses. So here we have our metal cutters, and we're going to approach them pretty much the same way. Each of these cutters gets 5 petals made with it. You can also see that I am working on a sill pat here, and I'm doing that mainly because modeling chocolate can get a little sticky. And then I'm going to take a little bit of my waste here, and I'm going to make the center for my rose. If you've used the styrofoam rose centers before for making gum paste roses, then you're familiar with the teardrop shape that we use as the base for the rose. I like to make my center before I finish my petals because that way it has a chance to set up a little bit. So teardrop, it's about the size of the top joint of my thumb. And then I have a cell pad here, which is basically just a piece of dense foam that you can use to tool your petals with. And I'm going lightly around the edge just to thin it out. The chocolate is a little thick. You can't roll it that thin or it won't hold its shape very well. So we want to give the illusion of it being thinner than it actually is. I'm going to use a silicone mold to add a little bit of extra detail to my rose petals. And you won't see the effect of this necessarily right away, but later when we paint, this is going to make the paint show up a little bit better and also give us some more detail. For those people who haven't worked with modeling chocolate much in the past, it is a mixture of melted chocolate and either corn syrup or glucose. It's easy to make at home. You do have to prepare it well in advance. It often has to sit for 24 to 72 hours after you've initially mixed it. There are a lot of recipes out there for it. They're all basically the same. Find one that you like and stick with that. You can also make it and freeze it so that you have it when you need it. I've now textured all of my petals, and I'm going to take my rose center and wet down the surface of the leaf. The nice thing about modeling chocolate is it does adhere to itself pretty well with water because of the glucose or corn syrup in it. The first 2 petals that you put on your center are your foundation. So you want to get a nice curl, and you want all of these to be pretty well adhered on the bottom so that you're not desperately trying to hold your petals in place while you are putting your other petals on. Then come the last 3 of the smaller petals. You'll notice I'm putting the water mainly on the bottom of the petal here and on one side because that is the part that we want to stick. And the other part we don't want to stick because that's what's going to give it an illusion of life. So your center 5 petals, the ones cut with the smaller cutter, get wrapped fairly closely. And this is your best chance to do any sort of adjustments that you need to. Very occasionally, I will make my center too long. Now I could cut off the bottom if I needed to. This one has actually turned out pretty well. And then we get our next 5 petals. Same thing, bottom and one side. Make sure that you are consistently doing the same side on all of them so that it doesn't get confusing later. I'm right-handed, so I usually push the water up the left side of the petal, and then my roses rotate clockwise. If you are left-handed, feel free to rotate them in an anti-clockwise direction. So now that I have all of my petals in place, you can push open the petals a little bit with your fingers, and it gives it an illusion of being light. So we're going to set that to the side and let it set up for a little bit while we make some more flowers. So there are 3 different types of roses that I made for this cake. The full rose, a tea rose, which has 5 small petals, and a bud. So let's do our tea rose. We're going to take a bit of our scrap from cutting out our petals, and we're going to make a center again. You can make your centers well ahead of time and make centers for all of the flowers you intend to make, and then you're not doing them as you go. You do have to use the petals soon after you tool them, however, because modeling chocolate, once it starts to settle and set up, will crack on the surface. So prepping these petals is just like prepping the first row of petals for the large rose. I ball tooled them. I'm squashing them in the mold. If you don't have a silicone petal mold at home, the palms of your hands actually make pretty good petal veining. You can lay a petal against your hand, press it gently, and you'll have something that will catch the paint later. Just like the large rose, we're going to wet 2 of the petals, and these will be our center petals. You're going to wrap it around the center so that you have a cone with an opening. Tuck in the second petal, and then do all of your squashing on the base. And this is going to support everything. Same thing here. I'm putting water on the base and on one side of the petal. And then you're just tucking them into one another all along the sides. If you've made sugar roses before, none of this is unfamiliar to you. The main difference with modeling chocolate is that it's very sensitive to heat, so you want to make sure that you're not holding it too tightly or holding it too long in your hands. That is our tea rose. And we're just going to make a rosebud. For this, we need 3 of the smallest petal and a little bit of scrap for our center. The only real difference in making the rosebud from making the tea rose or the big rose is instead of fully wrapping your first 2 petals, you're going to tuck your third one in right along with the other ones. So you get this 3-petal array, squash the bottom, and there we have some chocolate roses. So next we're going to make the water lily, and this is a little bit tricky because there isn't an internal structure that really holds it together. So I have a couple of orchid petal cutters here that I stole off of a set of, I think it was a Cattleya orchid set, or maybe a Dendrobium, but they're a good size. I have a small petal and a large petal. I also have a small glass bowl here, which is going to help me keep my petals in the right configuration until the modeling chocolate sets up enough to hold its own. I'm going to put a small amount of cornstarch in the bottom of this just so that I don't end up just gluing everything to the bowl. So for this, I'm going to cut 6 of my 2 shapes. This requires a little bit more work from you using a modeling tool because at least I don't have a mold that makes a nice water lily texture, so I've been faking it. So same as with my rose, I'm going to ball tool the edges of my petals. So I'm going to gently texture the top of the petal and the base of the petal and flip it over and do the same. And this is going to give me something for my paint to cling on to later. And then I'm going to just brush my fingers across it lightly to soften any of my tool marks. And just to give myself a basis, once I have 3 of these, I'm going to put them in my bowl. So the purpose behind having them in the bowl is it will keep them from flattening out completely. And when the chocolate has set up and we take it out of the bowl and set it on a flat surface, it will retain some of that curve and give us more dimension. And as it sets up, you can do things like coax the petals inward a bit so that you get a little bit more dimension. My first one is now lending itself to that a little bit better. All right, while that's setting up, we're going to take a little bit of our scrap and we're gonna make a center for our water lily. So not much of the center is gonna show, but we still need something in the center, and they have a pretty specific looking center that has quite a bit of texture. So we're going to make something in shape pretty similar to what we made for the rose. So there's a teardrop, and I'm just gonna texture all around with my all-purpose sculpting tool. I'm going to cut a strip of my rolled out modeling chocolate. This is just left over from doing the petals, so it's the same thickness. And I'm going to make a fringe. So this is a little bit longer than one of my fingers, and I am measuring stuff against my hand for the reason that if your hands are smaller than mine, you still want to keep things relatively in proportion to your hands, because it is easier to handle things. I'm going to wet the inside of it, and this is going to get wrapped around the base of our center. And that's the center of your water lily. Let's wet the center and put on our inner layer here. Now you may find when you do this that you lose some of the form and you need to throw it back in one of the bowls for a few minutes. Now wet the center. So this center is showing a little bit more of the base than I want it to. And the wonderful thing about modeling chocolate is I just cut off what would otherwise show up, drop that down into the center of the flower, fan out my fringe, and that's about it. So we're going to leave that alone for a little while we make some other items. I'm going to make a tulip in pink because everything else I've made so far has been in white. So this is a little bit of the pink that I made. None of these flowers use drastically different methods to accomplish all of the techniques. So again, you're going to cut out your petals. In this case, a standard tulip has 6 petals. The main difference we're going to do here is we're going to make a solid inside for the tulip instead of making them hollow the way that we would for gum paste or fondant. And the reason for this is the chocolate is in fact quite malleable, and well, my instinct is always to make everything exactly as it is in life. It's very hard to attach them to the cake if they're hollow. So we are going to make closed tulips that are easy to attach to a cake. We're going to make our center about the size of our finished tulip. And we're going to make a capsule shape. Well, that's about it. We're about 1.5 inches long maybe. I'm making my center a little bit shorter than the size of my petal. Let's leave that to the side and let it set up. Now I do have a tulip mold. I think that you kind of need one in order to make any kind of sugar tulips, whether it's modeling chocolate or anything else. I'm going to do a trick with the petals here where I'm going to put my tulip petal on my palm and I'm going to run my ball tool across it, and this makes it scooped. You may want a little bit of cornstarch on your hands to do this, just in case you're already a little sticky from handling paste. You're not going to push down so hard that it gets stuck to your hand. You just want to give it a little extra help. There we go. Those are our 6 petals for our tulips. I'm going to wet the petals a bit, and they're going to get wrapped around the center. So the first 3 petals, you want them to adhere pretty closely because you really don't want any of the center to show at all. Remember, we are making a closed tulip so that we don't have to wrestle with hollow flowers in modeling chocolate. And just like the rose, we're going to do most of our squashing to keep it together down here at the bottom so that we get a little bit of negative space here that'll make it look a little lighter and airier than it is. And that's our tulip. We're going to make some leaves, and we're going to do 2 different types. And while we're at it, we're also going to put some calyxes on our roses. Calyx is basically the little green fringe that sits on the base of the rose where the stem hits. We're also going to make some stems, which are going to lay flat against our cake and give us the illusion of having a three-dimensional rose, even though in fact everything is going to be well adhered to the sides of our cake. So first I'm going to make some tulip leaves. This is another part of an orchid cutter set. If you apply a little bit of imagination, you can do a lot more with the equipment you already have access to. So I'm just softening the edges of my leaves. Once I ball tooled them, I'm just going to handle them lightly. I'm going to texture this a little bit with my all-purpose modeling tool. And then once I'm kind of happy with the way they look, I'm going to go down the center and give it the center vein. And then sometimes once I'm done with the modeling part, I like to just give them a little bit of a stretch and a fold. And this just gives them a little bit more of an organic shape. And then I leave them to the side to set up. So while we still have some green here, I'm going to do a couple of rose leaves as well. I have 3 cutters in different sizes for rose leaves. If you have 1 cutter, by all means, make everything the same size. So I have a leaf mold that will make very nice, realistic looking leaves for me. This is what you can do if you don't, in fact, have access to one of those. Is you can use your all-purpose tool, put a line down the center, and then just lightly give yourself a few details. This is mainly so that the food color, when we paint them later, has something to settle into. Then I'm gonna give it a fold and a stretch, just like I did with the other leaves. And the other ones I'm gonna smash in a mold because I have access to one. This is absolutely the most standard rose leaf mold. All right, I'm gonna put some calyxes on my roses. So I have 2 calyx cutters. If you only have 1 calyx cutter, again, feel free to use your imagination a little bit and find a way to make it fit with what you need it to. The large calyx is for the full-size rose. The smaller calyx cutter is for the tea rose and the rosebud. I like the contrast of having some green on top of the colors for the other flowers. So these are going to reach up quite high on the body of the flowers. So we're just going to soften them. The real emphasis is on making the edges thinner so that it looks a lot more delicate than it is, the same as you would with the roses and the tulips and the other leaves. And then we're just going to glue these on with some water. We should be able to handle our flowers pretty easily at this point because they've been sitting off to the side in this relatively cool room for a little bit. As tempting as it may be to put your flowers in the refrigerator to speed it, don't recommend it. It sometimes makes moisture come to the surface and then they will be harder to paint. You want to get everything attached to your cake before it goes into the refrigerator when you're not going to have to handle it anymore. So there's our calyx on our rose, tea rose, and our rosebud. Tulips don't receive calyxes and neither do water lilies. Now we've made our roses, our tulip, our water lily, we've made some greens. At this point now you would go on to make several of each of these and then you would leave them to the side to set up before you paint them. Everything is much easier to handle if it's had a little time to settle on its own. So while we're waiting for that, let's sculpt a swan. We're going to do it in relief style, which means it's going to be flat backed so it'll sit tight against our cake. We're doing it in modeling chocolate, the same white that we made our flowers out of earlier. And I have a piece of styrofoam cake dummy so that I can let it rest on a curve, which will help me adhere it to the cake better. I like to make the basis for my swan in as few pieces as possible because that'll give me a little bit more structural integrity. Remember, the whole point of this is that we're doing a highly decorated cake that has minimal non-edible support in it. Here I have my vague swan shape and I'm going to refine it a little bit. So at this point, I can take my swan and I can force it down onto my cake dummy. And this way I know roughly how it's going to lay against my cake. So next we're going to add some wings. The back wing is going to be flat against the cake and I'm just going to trace out some feathers. So this is another nice all-purpose tool These are sometimes called scalpel tools, even though they're not in fact sharp. This one's acrylic, which is what I prefer for working with chocolate and sugar. And I'm just going to use this to angle a little bit and then add a little bit of texture to the feathers. A little bit goes a long way, and if you do a little bit of research, you can find some very stylized swans. And there we have our back wing with some of the feather details. And we're just gonna stick that behind here. See, I made this little tab on its back, which is gonna help that stick. And I'll show you how we're gonna blend that down. Now we're at this point where we have our basis for our swan. It has its back wing. I'm going to add a few more details before I put the front wing on. I like to add a little bit of feather texture. We are gonna put a little bit of food color on this. So having a little bit of texture on it, even if we soften it out a bit with our fingers afterwards, means that there's some place for the color to settle into, and we won't have to work as hard later. So I'm just going to put a little bit of an indent for my eye, and then I'm going to drop a little bit of modeling chocolate into that indent. And then when we paint this up, the eye is also usually black, unless you're doing a black swan, in which case it's red. And again, before we get to the point where we're attaching our outside wing and making this more final is when you want to pick it up for the last time and smooth any edges or deal with anything that you're not crazy about. And this is when I might do things like angle the neck. You can still do some of this later, but once you get that front wing on, which is going to stick up and have to self-support a little bit more, you really want to handle it as little as you absolutely have to. Now we have our very stylized swan wing. I'll rub it against a damp cloth, and then that gives it more area that's sticky, and I can arrange my wing. Swans' wings tend to sort of curl inward over top of their bodies when they're in this sort of resting posture, and that's quite pretty, so we're going to give it that feel. And that is our swan. So this is the best part. Everything is sculpted, and now we get to paint it. I have a bunch of different colors here. These are powdered pigments. So I have some pinks, some blues, some yellows, some greens. This is sort of an olive green, which I find terribly useful. You can mix this yourself. I did it ahead of time. And all it is regular green, a little bit of yellow, and a little bit of black powder all mixed together. And we're going to start with that. So we're going to use our olive green on the leaves that we're going to call tulip leaves for now. I painted a few of these ahead of time. So these I raked a little bit more texture into, and when you're making your leaves, you can actually do a mix of minimally detailed ones like these that I did earlier and more detailed ones and mix them together, and that way you don't have to do as much work, and you also don't get that sort of visual confusion of having too much detail and too much color layered on top of itself. When you really layer a bunch of stuff together on top of itself, sometimes the detail competes with itself and you just lose your definition. I also have some grain alcohol here. So I'm just going to use my brush to put a bit of it into one of my dishes here, and that'll give me a fine wash. I don't want to wet down all of my pigment at once because it makes it too hard to control the color. My leaves are just going to get a coating of this olive green, and as you can see, it settles into my details. If you have gloves, this is a good time to put them on. I didn't bring any, so I'm just going to go right ahead and dye my fingers every color of the rainbow. We're going to do something a little bit different for the rose leaves. As you can see here, I painted a few of them in advance, and they have a pink tint to them, and it gives them just a little bit of extra dimension. So as you can see, I'm going to go directly from my green to my pink. So the same thing, I'm just going to put a wash onto each leaf. If you have to do an entire wedding cake full of these, I recommend finding some good podcasts to listen to. Let's paint our roses first, since that's what we sculpted first. So we'll start with the pink since I had it out for the rose leaves. And you always want to start with your edge and let the color settle on the edge and diffuse as it goes down the petal. And that way, if it's too heavy anywhere, you can just kind of wipe it down the sides. And you don't have to be terribly precious about this. You know, you're just trying to get some color on there, define the edges of the petals, and pick up some of the texture. And again, these will dry a little bit shinier than when we first started, but it's okay because plants do have a little bit of a waxier surface than the unpainted surface of modeling chocolate. And anyway, these are chocolate, and it's okay for them to look a little less realistic because our intention here is to make a fully edible cake decoration. So that's a very subtle tint of color on our roses. And we can always go back onto them later once they've dried. And then for the white ones, the pink is going to show up a little bit more because we're working off of white. And so we have to be a little bit more careful. So I'm going to start by putting full color on the edge and then rinsing my brush in a little bit of the alcohol so I can diffuse the color as it goes down into the petal. And if you want a little bit of a watercolor effect, when your petal is wet, you can hit it with a little bit more color and it'll spread into the part that already has wet alcohol on it. So now that we painted all of our roses, we're going to do our tulips. And the tulips I'm going to keep fairly light, but because this is a solid flower that we made around a big block of chocolate, so for the white ones, I'm just going in with a yellow wash, same as I did on some of my white roses. So now we're getting a bit of our magenta pigment to settle in the creases of our tulip. And last but not least are our water lilies. These are two that I made before. And here is ours that's been sitting in its bowl since we made it a little while ago. So to start with, I want to paint the center yellow. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to leave the little fringe white for now. And since I still have some of this bright pink pigment, I'm actually going to use that for the tips of my petals, just to do something a little bit different. The other trick that you can do here is if you have a color like this and you want to soften it but still be able to paint fairly heavy with it, is we can use a little bit of liquid white food color. And with the addition of the pigment and the alcohol, you can still make a pretty nice wash with it, but now it's a little bit opaque. It's time to paint the cake. As you'll see here, this is a really rough looking cake. I've covered it with modeling chocolate because modeling chocolate does indeed stick best to itself. Just to give myself a surface to paint on, I'm going to brush the entire surface with the alcohol. And all this is doing is it's giving me some consistency. So if there's any cornstarch that was on the chocolate when I wrapped the cake, it'll be gone now. I am just trying to load some color up onto this so that there's something underneath. And there we go. So now we have a watercolor basis. Now we can start putting everything on. Oh, I just realized I forgot to paint the swan. So let's do that. This is the back of my cake where my terrible seam is that hopefully will be covered by the time I'm done. So here is my melted chocolate, there is my back. I'm going to attach my swan here. And all of my design here is going to emanate from the swan, and it's going to cascade in either direction. So our swan is going to go on first. And see, because I built it on that piece of styrofoam, it has attached itself rather nicely. I didn't demonstrate it, but I have a banner and I have some lily pads that are part of this design. So if you are more comfortable doing your lettering with a food color marker, now is a good time to go and get those out. I like to do my lettering with a brush, I don't have a good excuse for this. I just learned to letter with a brush back before everybody used computers for their lettering on their comic books. And so now that's what I do. Just whenever I have to write stuff on a cake, I get out a brush. You want to practice a little bit if this isn't something you do regularly. Honestly, it never hurts to practice your lettering first anyway. So there we have our banner. So I just want to have this ready because I'm going to put some leaves down here first before I attach it so that it looks like my sketch. But I want to be able to put it down while the leaves are still a little malleable. So I'm trying to follow my sketch as much as I can, mainly so that I'm not using or wasting any of the things that I've made already. But I'm also just kind of putting things how they look best to me. The sketch is not the complete end-all. You have some creative freedom. Sometimes you have to work with the shape of the cake. Sometimes when you actually get everything in place, what you thought was going to look nice doesn't look as nice. And that's fine. I mean, you always have to have a little bit of artistic license. So be a little bit flexible with what you see in your mind. So now we get to do the fun part, and we're going to cut straight through one of our roses here. I love doing that. It's like my favorite thing right now. There's just a few more things to put on, and hey, it's Christine, come on over.
Hey, it's me. Hey, how's it going?
All right, I think it's turning out pretty well.
Oh my goodness.
Not-
Anna, this is stunning.
Not bad for modeling
Oh
chocolate,
my
huh?
gosh.
So I just have a few more things to put on.
Sure.
So now we're completely done,
Wow.
which is great.
She turned out great. I mean, look at those flowers. The detail you can get through modeling chocolate is ridiculous.
Well, it looks very delicate. I mean, like, this is a fair amount of dense chocolate, and somebody is going to end up with that on their piece and be really lucky. I also like how the watercolor effect on the actual cake mirrors the painting that's on the flowers.
Even just the detail in the wings of this swan, I'm just kind of swooning over. You did a beautiful job.
Oh, I'm just glad you like it. Well, now we get to cut it.
Now we get to cut it!
All right, are we ready?
Let's do it.
Oops, I'm underneath the cake.
That is some pink cake.
All right. I mean, the modeling chocolate has a texture and flavor a little bit like a really fancy Tootsie Roll.
I was just about to say, it's almost got like a chew texture to it. Ugh. See, now I want the one with the flower.
All right, I'll trade with you.
Can I have the one with the flower?
Cheers.
Cheers. And I get 2 flowers. Gotta get all of that in there.
Oh, it tastes really pink.
You did a great job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for helping me eat my cake.
Absolutely. Anytime. Oh, yeah. I can eat this vanilla cake all day.
Well, I thought with all of the chocolate on the outside that I might go safe this time and do vanilla inside.
Yeah, but I'm assuming next time you'll do chocolate, I hope.
Just for you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, I'm definitely not bored anymore. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, tell your friends, and we'll see you next time.